Before the Revolutionary War, numerous societies were organized to aid the cause of independence. These were sometimes called Sons of Liberty, and not infrequently Sons of St. Tammany, after an Indian brave whom tradition had shrouded in virtue. The name was probably adopted to burlesque the royalist societies named after St. George, St. David, or St. Andrew. After the war, these societies vanished. But in New York City, William Mooney, an upholsterer, reorganized the local society as Tammany Society, devoted ostensibly to good fellowship and charity. Its offices bore Indian titles, and its ceremonies were more or less borrowed from the Aboriginal Americans, not merely because of their unique and picturesque character, but to emphasize the truly American and anti-British convictions of its members. The society attracted that element of the town's population which delighted in the crude ceremonials and the stimulating potions that always accompanied them, mostly small shopkeepers and mechanics. It was among this class that the spirit of discontent against the power of federalism was strongest, a spirit that has often become decisive in our political fortunes. This was still the day of the gentleman, of small clothes, silver shoe buckles, powdered wigs, and lace ruffles. Only taxpayers and property persons could vote, and public office was still invested with certain prerogatives and privileges. Democracy was little more than a name. There was, however, a distinct division of sentiment, and the drift towards democracy was accelerated by immigration. The newcomers were largely of the humble classes, among whom the doctrines of democratic discontent were welcome. Tammany soon became partisan. The Federalist members withdrew, probably influenced by Washington's warning against secret political societies. By 1798, it was a Republican club meeting in various taverns, finally selecting Martling's Long Room for its nightly carousals. Soon after this, a new constitution was adopted, which adroitly transformed the society into a compact political machine, every member subscribing to the oath that he would resist the encroachments of centralized power over the state. Tradition has it that the transformer of Tammany into the first compact and effective political machine was Aaron Burr. There is no direct evidence that he wrote the new constitution. Indeed, it would not have been Burrian had he left any written evidence of his connection with the organization. For Burr was one of those intriguers who revel in mystery, who always hide their designs and never bind themselves in writing without leaving a dozen loopholes for escape. He was by this time a prominent figure in American politics. His skill had been displayed in Albany, both in the passing of legislation and in outmaneuvering Hamilton, and having himself elected United States Senator against the powerful combination of the Livingstons and the Schuylers. He was plotting for the presidency as the campaign of 1800 approached, and Tammany was to be the fulcrum to lift him to this conspicuous place. Under the ostensible leadership of Matthew L. Davis, Burr's chief lieutenant, every ward of the city was carefully organized, a polling list was made, scores of new members were pledged to Tammany, and during the 3 days of voting in New York State until 1840, elections lasted 3 days. While Hamilton was making eloquent speeches for the Federalists, Burr was secretly manipulating the wires of his machine. Burr and Tammany won in New York City, though Burr failed to win the presidency. The political career of this remarkable organization was now well launched. From that time, the history of Tammany Hall is a tale of victories, followed by occasional disclosures of corruption and favoritism, of quarrels with governors and presidents, of party fights between upstate and city, of skulking when its sachems were unwelcome in the White House, of periodical displays of patriotism, for cloaking its grosser crimes of perennial charities, for fastening itself more firmly on the poorer populace, which has always been the source of its power, of colossal municipal enterprise for profit sharing, and of a continuous political efficiency due to sagacious leadership, a remarkable adaptability to the necessities of the hour, and a patience that outlasts every reform. It early displayed all the traits that have made it successful. In 1801, for the purpose of carrying city elections, it provided 39 men with money to purchase houses and lots in one ward, and 70 men with money for the same purpose in another ward, thus manufacturing freeholders for polling purposes. In 1806, Benjamin Romaine, a grand sachem was removed from the office of city controller by his own party for acquiring land from the city without paying for it. In 1807, several superintendents of city institutions were dismissed for frauds. Mooney, the founder of the society, now superintendent of the almshouse, was caught in a characteristic fraud. His salary was $1,000 a year, with $500 for family expenses. But it was discovered that his expenses amounted to $4,000 a year, and that he had credited to himself on the books $1,000 worth of supplies and numerous sums for trifles for Mrs. Mooney. In September 1826, the grand jury entered an indictment against Matthew L. Davis and a number of other Tammany men for defrauding several banks and insurance companies of over $2,000. This created a tremendous sensation. Political influence was at once set in motion, and only the minor defendants were sent to the penitentiary. In 1829, Samuel Swartout, one of the Tammany leaders, was appointed collector of the port of New York. His downfall came in 1838, and he fled to Europe. His defalcation in the custom house were found to be over 1.2 million, and to Swartout became a useful phrase until Tweed's day. He was succeeded by Jesse Hoyt, another sachem and notorious politician, against whom several judgments for default were recorded in the Superior Court, which was satisfied very soon after his appointment. It was in 1851 that the council commonly known as the 40 Thieves was elected. Some of the maneuvers of this council and of other officials were divulged by a grand jury in its presentment of February 23, 1853. The presentment states, "It was clearly shown that enormous sums of money were spent for the procurement of railroad grants in the city, and that towards the decision and procurement of the 8th Avenue Railway grant, a sum so large that would startle the most credulous was expended, but in consequence of the voluntary absence of important witnesses, the grand jury was left without direct testimony of the particular recipients of the different amounts." These and other exposures brought on a number of amendments to the city charter, surrounding with greater safeguards the sale or lease of city property and the letting of contracts, and a reform council was elected. A reform candidate was elected mayor in 1863, but Tammany returned to power 2 years later by securing the election and then the re-election of John T. Hoffman. Hoffman possessed considerable ability and an attractive personality. His zeal for high office, however, made him easily amenable to the manipulators. Tammany made him governor and planned to name him for president. Behind his popularity, which was considerable, and screened by the greater excitements of the war, Reconstruction, and the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, lurked the ring, whose exposures and confessions were soon to amaze everyone. The chief ringster was William Tweed, and his name will always be associated in the public mind with political bossdom. This is his immortality. He was a chairmaker by trade, a vulgar good fellow by nature, a politician by circumstances, a boss by evolution, and a grafter by choice. He became Grand Sachem of Tammany and chairman of the General Committee. This committee he ruled with blunt directness. When he wanted a question carried, he failed to ask for the negative votes, and soon he was called the boss, a title he never resented, and which usage has since fixed in our politics. So he ruled Tammany with a high hand, made nominations arbitrarily, bullied, bought, and traded, became president of the Board of Supervisors, thus holding the key to the city's financial policies, and was elected state senator, thereby directing the granting of legislative favors to his city and to his corporations. In 1868, Tammany carried Hoffman into the governor's chair, and in the following year the Democrats carried the state legislature. Tweed now had a new charter passed, which virtually put New York City into his pocket by placing the finances of the metropolis entirely in the hands of a board of apportionment which he dominated. Of this board, the mayor of the city was the chairman, with the power to appoint the other members. He promptly named Tweed, Connolly, and P.B. Sweeney. This was the famous ring the mayor was Okie Hall, dubbed Elegant OK by his pals because of his fondness for clubs, society, puns, and poems, but Nast called him OK Hall. Sweeney, commonly known as Pete, was a lawyer of ability and was generally believed to be the plotter of the quartet. Nast transformed his middle initial B into brains, Connolly was just a coarse gangster. There was some reason for the Ring's faith in its invulnerability. It controlled governor and legislature, was formidable in the national councils of the Democratic Party, and its governor was widely mentioned for the presidential nomination. It possessed complete power over the city council, the mayor, and many of the judges. It was in partnership with Gould and Fiske of the Erie, then reaping great harvests in Wall Street, and with Street Railway and other public service corporations. Through untold largesse, it silenced rivalry from within and criticism from without. And when suspicion first raised its voice, it adroitly invited a committee of prominent and wealthy citizens, headed by John Jacob Astor, to examine the controller's accounts. After 6 hours spent in the City Hall, Lee's respectable gentlemen signed an equipment saying that the affairs of the city under the charge of the controller are administered in a correct and faithful manner. Thus, entrenched, the Ring levied tribute on every municipal activity. Everyone who had a charge against the city, either for work done or materials furnished, was told to add to the amount of his bill, at first 10%, later 66%, and finally 85%. One man testified that he was told to raise to $55,000 his claim of $5,000. He got his 5 and the Ring got 50. The building of the courthouse was estimated to cost $3 million, but it cost many times that. The item repairing fixtures amounted to $1.5 million before the building was completed. 40 chairs and 3 tables cost $179,729. G.S. Miller, a carpenter, received $360,147, and a plasterer named Gray $2.8 million for 9 months' work. Carpets cost $350,000, most of the Brussels and Axminster going to the new Metropolitan Hotel just opened by Tweed's son. The Ring's hold upon the legislature was through bribery, not through partisan adhesion. Tweed himself confessed that he gave one man in Albany $600,000 for buying votes to pass his charter, and Samuel J. Tilden estimated the total cost for this purpose at over $1 million. Tweed said he bought 5 Republican senators for $40,000 each. The vote on the charter was 30-2 in the Senate, 116-5 in the Assembly. Another kind of memorial to his genius for absorbing the people's money was awaiting this philanthropic buccaneer. Vulgar ostentation was the outward badge of these civic burglaries. Tweed moved into a Fifth Avenue mansion and gave his daughter a wedding at which she received $100,000 worth of gifts. Her wedding dress was a $5,000 creation. At Greenwich, he built a country estate where the stables were framed of choice mahogany. Sweeney hobnobbed with Jim Fisk of the Erie. The Tweed of Wall Street who went about town dressed in loud checks and lived with his harem in his opera house on 8th Avenue. Thoughtful citizens saw these things going on and believed the city was being robbed, but they could not prove it. Finally, proof did come, and, as is usual in such cases, it came from the inside. James O'Brien, an ex-sheriff and the leader in a democratic reform movement, calling itself Young Democracy, secured the appointment of one of his friends as clerk in the comptroller's office. Transcripts of the accounts were made, and these O'Brien brought to the Times, which began their publication July 8, 1871. The Ring was in consternation. It offered George Jones, the proprietor of the Times, $5 million for his silence and sent a well-known banker to Nast with an invitation to go to Europe to study art, with $100,000 for expenses. A public meeting in Cooper Institute, April 6, 1871, was addressed by William E. Dodge, Henry Ward Beecher, William M. Evarts, and William F. Havemeyer. They vehemently denounced Tweed and his gang. Tweed, Sweeney, and Hall, now alarmed by the disclosures in the Times, decided to make Connolly the scapegoat and asked the aldermen and supervisors to appoint a committee to examine his accounts. By the time the committee appeared for the examination, its purpose had been well announced. The vouchers for 1869 and 1870 had disappeared. Mayor Hall then asked for Connolly's resignation, but instead, Connolly consulted Samuel J. Tilden, who advised him to appoint Andrew H. Green, a well-known and respected citizen, as his deputy. This turned the tables on the 3 other members of the Ring, whose efforts to oust both Connolly and Green were unavailing. In this manner, the citizens got control of the treasury books, and the grand jury began its inquisitions. Sweeney and Connolly soon fled to Europe. Sweeney afterwards settled for $400,000 and returned. Hall's case was presented to a grand jury, which proved to be packed. A new panel was ordered, but failed to return an indictment because of lack of evidence. Hall was subsequently indicted, but his trial resulted in a disagreement. Tweed was indicted for felony. He remained at large on bail and was twice tried in 1873. The first trial resulted in a disagreement, the second in a conviction. His sentence was a fine of $12,000 and 12 years imprisonment. When he arrived at the penitentiary, he answered the customary questions. What occupation? Statesman? What religion? None. He served 1 year and was then released on a flimsy technicality by the Court of Appeals. Civil suits were now brought, and, unable to obtain the $3 million bail demanded, the fallen boss was sent to jail. He escaped to Cuba and finally to Spain, but he was again arrested, returned to New York on a man of war, and put into Ludlow Street Jail, where he died April 12, 1878, apparently without money or friends. The exact amount of the plunder was never ascertained. An expert accountant employed by the house cleaners estimated that for 3 years, 1868 through 71, the frauds totaled between $45 and $50 million. The estimate of the Aldermen's Committee was $60 million. Tweed never gave any figures. He probably had never counted his gains, but merely spent them as they came. O'Rourke, one of the gang, estimated that the ring stole about $75 million between 1865 and 1871, and that, counting vast issues of fraudulent bonds, the looting probably amounted to $200 million.